I have a really short question for you. Lab leak, yes or no?
Say it again.
Lab leak, yes or no?
A lab leak, I see. No, I can't be more definitive about this. No.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to this new episode of Little Brains Big Topics. It's been a year, but I'm back. I'm back. I'm not going anywhere. Don't you guys worry. I'm back. We're going to be continuing with more new, exciting episodes of Little Brains Big Topics. I've been busy a little bit in the past year, busy with my university, but it's hopefully I can manage my time much better this year, and we shall continue these episodes. So I've seen the subscriber count grow in the past year. I've seen us getting a lot of views. So there seems to be a lot of people seems to be enjoying what we're doing. We're not going to stop. This is just the beginning. Don't worry, guys. But yeah, so today I had an interview with Professor Paul Offit. We interviewed him about 1.5 years ago, nearly at the beginning of the pandemic, to talk about vaccine development. Now we had him on again to discuss different types of vaccines. We discuss about sort of the global response to the COVID pandemic. We talk about the lab leak theory. We discuss potential short-term and long-term impacts of COVID vaccines. Um, we talk about uh, Professor Offit's new book. So a lot of things, and that are like relevant if you've been living through the past 2 years, really, past year and a half. So if you've been living through these times, you really want to know the answers to a lot of these questions. Um, and yeah, so I'm just going to tell you guys who Paul Offit is, for those of you who might not be familiar with him. So Paul Allan Offit is an American pediatrician specializing in infectious diseases, vaccines, immunology, and virology. He is the co-inventor of a rotavirus vaccine. Offit is the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology, Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania, former chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases, and the director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He has been a member of the Centers for Disease Control (CDC) Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Offit is a board member of Every Child by Two and a founding member of the Autism Science Foundation (ASF). Offit has published more than 130 papers in medical and scientific journals in the areas of rotavirus-specific immune responses and vaccine safety, and is the author or co-author of books on vaccines, vaccination, and antibiotics. He is one of the most public faces of scientific consensus that vaccines have no association with autism. As a result, he has been the frequent target of hate mail and death threat. He has a new book coming out called You Bet Your Life, and it very much encapsulates the problems of whether we're at what point do we say, okay, we think that procedure is safe enough. What is the cost benefit analysis that we need to go through before making that choice? So I'm going to put a link to Professor Offit's book You Bet Your Life in the description of this video, or if you're listening on the audio version, there will be one in the description. Yeah, all in all, it was a really interesting conversation. I hope you guys enjoy. If you like it, please put up a positive review for us, or if you're watching on YouTube, drop a like, drop a comment if you disagree with any of the points made. I'm happy to hear your points of views. Yeah, hope you guys enjoy this episode.
Please.
Have
So
fun.
last time we had an interview, it was at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. How would you assess the global response to the pandemic in general?
Well, it's been variable. I mean, some countries were much better at shutting down, much better at testing early on to see where the epidemic was spreading, much better at social distancing, much better at masking. I mean, the United States wasn't particularly good at this. We have roughly 4% of the world's population, but 20% of the world's deaths. So I think it's interesting how the response to the pandemic, I think in large part, is reflective of the nature to which the society sees itself as all in it together. I feel like our country doesn't see it that way, which is why we're suffering this.
I see. So what do you think accounts for the large disparity of deaths among like different populations?
Well, I think to some extent it's a difference in the availability of technology. To some extent, it's a difference in the quality of the healthcare system, and to some extent, and maybe to a large extent, it's how the society sees itself. I think in the United States we are tired of this pandemic, and so we are in many ways acting as if it doesn't happen. We only have a little more than half of the population that's been vaccinated. We have 60, 70, 80 million Americans who are saying that they don't want a vaccine, that they see this as a personal liberty, as a civil liberty to not get a vaccine. So I think there's a lot of different reasons for why there's differences among countries.
And what are so over the course of the past year and a half, what were some of the predictors of COVID hospitalization? I mean, now we know it's probably you're not vaccinated, but before then, what were some of the biggest predictors?
Well, so I think probably the biggest predictor is the virus that was circulating. I mean, we've gone from the first variant, the so-called D614G variant, which was replaced by the Alpha variant because the Alpha variant was more contagious, which has been replaced now by the Delta variant, which is even more contagious, much more transmissible. So I think that's one. The other predictors, I think, are obviously the percent of the population that's been vaccinated, the willingness of a population to wear masks, especially when they're in high-risk situations like indoors or among large crowds of people. So I think all of those affect the spread of this virus.
And are there any drugs that show any promise with regards to COVID hospitalization, helping people? Or prevention even?
Well, prevention, it's vaccines. Okay. If you're early on in infection, before you're hospitalized, when you're just at the beginning of illness, clearly monoclonal antibodies are of value. Dexamethasone, when you're in the hospital and you meet certain criteria for lower respiratory tract disease, pneumonia, is clearly of value. There are a lot of things that aren't of value. I think the antiviral drug remdesivir was not at particularly much value. Ivermectin obviously is not of value.
I was going to ask about that. So the whole hype on Twitter about ivermectin, is it fully baseless?
No, my favorite is there's a video going around by the Lincoln Project, which does a spoof of ivermectin. At the end, they say, Ask your large animal veterinarian whether ivermectin is right for you. It's perfect. Just say nay.
Yeah, I think it all started from Joe Rogan. It originated there and then expanded into. So I think we've touched on this a little bit, but what policies do you think were the most effective at combating COVID, and what policies do you think were, maybe overreach, maybe not necessary?
Well, I think China, which has a population about 1.5 times or 5 times, or about 5 times greater than ours. We have about 300 million. They have 1.5 billion. So 5 times greater than ours. They only, at least reportedly, had about 3,000 deaths early on, which was because they were very good at shutting down. They just quarantined, stay inside. and people listened. I mean, it's a society that acts as one unit, and that was impressive. Groups like South Korea were really good about doing early testing, masking, physical distancing, which had a much lower percentage of hospitalizations and deaths than our country did because they were good at that. We just weren't very good at that. We're a country founded on the basis of individual rights and freedoms, and we claim freedoms that we don't have, like the freedom to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. So different countries behave differently, and as a consequence, they were able to save lives. I mean, the previous administration, I think, worked on a lot of denialism. I think they were hoping if they just closed their eyes tightly enough, it would all go away. It didn't work that way.
And a lot of people think that that's what lost him the election.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think, when there's a crisis, people look to leaders to lead. And I think it was the home run pitch in many ways for our past president, our last president. But he just wasn't up to the task. He wasn't a good leader in that he couldn't really form a task force that defined, what we needed to do for this pandemic. His plan was to just ignore it, hope it goes away. He only wanted to be fed good news about what the nature of the pandemic was. He surrounded himself with people like Scott Atlas, who just told him what he wanted to hear, even though it's not what the nation needed to hear. He tried to stifle the CDC in terms of providing information. He really pitted himself against the FDA, against the CDC, because he didn't get the kind of information that he wanted. So it was a tragedy. There's a book called Preventable by Andy Slavitt, which goes through all the things that were done so horribly wrongly by that last administration.
And he got COVID. Along with our version of Trump here, they both got COVID.
No, and he tried to minimize that. I mean, when he would go around in a motor car with Secret Service agents that didn't have masks on. He didn't have a mask on, and so there were a number of people in the Secret Service that got infected. A lot of senators refused to go to the White House because they saw it as a place where there was going to be super spreader events. That was him. He was sick. He had the advantage of having enormous support, obviously, from a variety of consultants and experts, and he got remdesivir before the rest of us could get it. And when he got back to the White House after having survived, he takes off his mask and then walks in, and you wonder who was on the other side of that door, because he was no doubt still contagious.
Oh boy. He was definitely a unique individual. So do you think, was there, because I remember last time we had you on, you were talking about how there is a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to like COVID policies. Like, I remember you told us about, was it baseball that you wanted to go to, that you said it's closed? Was it baseball? Yeah. So
Probably baseball, yeah. Or football. We actually, I'm a Philadelphia Eagles, which is the National Football League team. I'm a season ticket holder. So
so that must have been the football then. Must have been the football. So yeah, was there a cost-benefit analysis considering like the damage to the economy from the lockdowns, some people's mental health issues? Was there do you think, there was ever any cost-benefit analysis when we were thinking about some of those more restrictive policies?
Sure. You always worry that that the cure would be worse than the disease, and I think that when you shut down people and ask them to quarantine and they can't go to work, or they have trouble getting people to take care of their children because the children can't go to school. Obviously, we suffer that. We suffered that massively. You had massive joblessness, massive homelessness. You had food insecurity. You had our rate of suicide increase, especially teen suicide. I mean, children certainly suffered the lack of socialization. By not going to school in Philadelphia, for many children, that was the only decent meal they got during the day. Child abuse is often only recognized in the school, so by not allowing kids to have on-site learning, there was a lot of harm in all that. On the other hand, more than 650,000 people have died in this country because of this virus, and because we weren't good enough at shutting things down, or at least doing it uniformly.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. So how many COVID variants are there? So that's one question, because every time in the news we seem to be running out of Greek alphabet now, going through them all one by one. So how many are there, and like what do we know about the different variants?
Well, usually when one variant replaces another, it's because it's more contagious. As we've gone from the D614G variant to the alpha variant to the Delta variant, which is clearly the most contagious. There are other variants of concern or variants of interest out there, like the Mu variant and the Lambda variant. It's not clear that either of those are more contagious than the current Delta variant, and so the Delta variant may reign supreme for a while. Interestingly, this coronavirus is not really a fast mutator. It's not like, say, influenza virus, which is a rapid mutator. It mutates slowly but efficiently. And we can get on top of this virus. We can. It's just that we need to have a level of population immunity, probably in the 90% range, meaning that either from natural infection or immunization or the combination of both, we need to have population immunity. And right now, at least in the United States, we're probably 60 to 80 million people short of that, and we need to find a way to get them vaccinated, because right now they're telling you they don't want to be vaccinated. So I think we're going to have to go to mandates.
Yeah, we will get to that definitely, because that's a really interesting topic. Before that, I have a really short question for you. Lab leak, yes or no?
Say it again.
Lab leak, yes or no?
A lab leak, I see. No. I can't be more definitive about this. No. There was a paper that just came out in Cell by Susan Weiss and coworkers where they go through all of this sort of the virology, that where you look at Wuhan, the viruses they were working with at Wuhan, and talk about sequence differences. I don't think this could be clearer. This is not, certainly it's not lab created. This is not a lab created virus. And I think for that reason, the same reason really, it's not a lab leaked virus. I don't think this was, I mean, any more than SARS-1 was a lab-created virus, or MERS was a lab-created virus, or Ebola is a lab-created virus, or HIV. I mean, these are all viruses that have their origins in animals that just jump to man. That's happens all the time.
What do you think of the former head of CDC's statement about the lab leak? Because he's the one who initially made an interview with CNN, and that's like when it became more mainstream. He said, "Oh yeah, trust me, I've been like studying viruses all my life, and I think this was made in the lab. Normal viruses, they're not adapted to." They said they don't. I think his statement was they don't become contagious this quickly when they jump species to species. So what would you say to him?
I think he's wrong. I should send you the paper. Your listening audience, viewing audience should read that paper, because it really is good. I mean, it came just out in Cell. It's called "The Origin of SARS-CoV-2," and it goes through point by point. There's about why this can't possibly be a lab leak. There's also a podcast in the United States called "This Week in Virology," or TWIV. It's run by Vince Racaniello, who's a virologist at Columbia. And for a few episodes, he's had people on his show that have virologists who've discussed this. And it is an overwhelming opinion among virologists who are specialists in this area that this was not a lab-created virus. I know it sounds more interesting. It's much more exciting, much more cloak and dagger and spies.
Yeah.
And the intelligence community at the university, at the United States, has sort of, at least raised the possibility, but this isn't that.
So not lab created. Is it possible that they were studying it in the lab and then it leaked?
I don't think so. I mean, the viruses that you see because people have gone in and looked at the viruses that were at that Wuhan Institute, and the viruses are so far away from this current virus. I mean, like 1,000 base pairs away. It's like saying we went from chimps to humans in a day. It's just not possible.
Right.
Of course, this assumes you believe in evolution, which is not a belief system.
Fair enough. No, I guess yeah. A lot of people don't these days. So I was gonna ask you about the different vaccines that have been created. And their efficacy. So would you recommend any vaccine, or the particular ones? What's the difference between them? Yeah.
I think the mRNA vaccines of Pfizer, Moderna, the J&J vaccine, which is an adenovirus vector vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is an adenovirus vector vaccines, the two whole inactivated viral vaccines that came out of the Beijing Institute, Sinopharm, are all excellent at protecting against serious illness. they are somewhat different in their ability to protect against more mild illness or asymptomatic infection. But I think the goal of this vaccine is protection against serious illness, to try and keep you out of the hospital, out of the intensive care unit, out of the morgue. And I think if that's the goal, these vaccines all will meet that goal. But again, they only work if you give them.
That makes sense. What do you think of the Russian and Chinese vaccines? Are they any reliable?
With the Chinese vaccines, the whole inactivated virus vaccines, was just a paper published in New England Journal of Medicine about one of the Chinese inactivated vaccines in Chile, and it performed very well against serious illness. The Russian vaccines, that's hard to know because I haven't seen as much data on that vaccine, which is a combination vaccine. It's two adenovirus vectored vaccines. One is adenovirus type 5, the other one is adenovirus type 26, which is the J&J vaccine. And again, I haven't seen a lot of data on that in terms of protection against serious illness, but love to see it.
Yeah, and I think the European Union, as of now, they don't accept the Chinese and Russian ones. So that's why. But you think the Chinese one is effective as of now, at least?
Yeah, no, if you asked me sort of a year ago or a year and a half ago when we first isolated the virus, what vaccine did I think would work the best, I actually would have picked the inactivated vaccines because unlike the vectored vaccines or the mRNA vaccines, it really includes all four viral proteins, which often can work to your advantage. But, right now, certainly the mRNA vaccines work extremely well. The vector vaccines also work, very well. So you got to be happy. It's remarkable to me that the past administration, we had that virus isolated in the sequence in January of 2020. 11 months later, we had two large clinical trials using vaccine technologies we'd never used before, the mRNA vaccine, and nonetheless, they worked extremely well. They were remarkably safe. It's really one of the greatest, if not the greatest, scientific achievement I've seen in my lifetime.
It's crazy to me that we knew it would work, even though we hadn't made a vaccine using that technology.
Yes. It's not like it's. The technology had been worked on for about 15 years or so in the research at the research level, but we'd never had any vaccine like this for people. It is remarkable to me also. The Trump administration created this. They did. They Operation Warp Speed, which was a $24 billion effort, really took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. I would think that Donald Trump would beat his chest and talk about how amazing this vaccine is that he created under his administration, but he hasn't. I think it's because he just doesn't like to put his name on things. He's a deeply modest man.
Yeah, there is a high chance he would have just called it the Trump vaccine if he was president when he came. And that might have actually helped with more people getting it. His base, I guess.
I think it would have. I really do think he could help things by saying, look, this is an important vaccine. He tried that at an Alabama rally recently, and he was booed for saying that. I think he tried a little bit to do that. It just didn't work for him, so he backed away.
Yeah, it's crazy to me how I've seen some videos of his supporters. They're like, I believe in everything he says except about vaccines. Even when he says like one right thing, they're like, no, that's the red line.
Right.
So what do you think of the global distribution of vaccines? And do you think, so there was talks about lifting the patents. Do you think if we had lifted the patents early on, would it have helped?
Yes, I think. The Operation Warp Speed paid for these vaccines. They paid for the phase 3 trials. They paid for mass production. They paid for the sites where these vaccines were being made. I think these companies owe a debt not only to the United States but to the world to distribute these vaccines as easily and broadly as possible. And it's not an altruistic act. What happens in other countries affects every country. We have 195 countries out there. Many have not given a single dose of vaccine. We're going to be dealing with this virus until this is controlled in the world. In the United States, every year we give a polio vaccine. We haven't had a case of polio in the United States since the late 1970s. We give it because polio still exists in Afghanistan, still exists in Pakistan. And so therefore we're still at risk. So it's not an altruistic act. We need to get this vaccine everywhere. And I do think these companies have an obligation to do that. They do. And I think at some level they haven't met that obligation.
Is it Bill Gates' fault? Because I'm hearing people saying he apparently, I don't know, he made them so they I don't know. Does Bill Gates have anything to do with it?
Now, Bill Gates has taken his $60 billion and said, what can I do that will make the most difference in this world? And the answer to that question was get vaccines out there. It's because of Bill Gates that we have a hepatitis B vaccine in 80% of this world. It's because of Bill Gates that we have a rotavirus vaccine, which I was fortunate enough to work on in this world, because he figures correctly, if his money is going to have impact, probably the best way for it to have impact is with vaccines. He's the opposite of that. I mean, just maybe it's because he's someone who promotes vaccines that he's seen as in some small circles as a bad guy, but he's a good guy.
Fair enough. No, I agree with you for the record. Yeah, I think I think he's done more good than bad overall, if we're saying it like that. And do you think there are any valid concerns about how quickly the vaccines were developed, and whether they were truly tested, given the small window of time they were developed in?
Well, so the normal timeline is this. Normally you do preclinical studies in experimental animals, mice, non-human primates. That wasn't skipped. That was done as you would expect it to be done. Then you do so-called phase 1 studies, dose-ranging studies, where you get the dose and the dosing interval. That wasn't skipped. Usually you go to phase 2 studies then, which is now you have the dose, you have the dosing interval, and then you vaccinate hundreds of people to make sure that it's consistently immunogenic and safe. What they did there was they did that at the same time they were doing the phase 3 studies. They went pretty quickly to phase 3, where now you're giving tens of thousands of people either the vaccine or the placebo to see whether it works. The size of those studies was the size of any typical adult or pediatric vaccine trial. 30,000 for Moderna, 40,000 for J&J, 40,000 for Pfizer. That's the size of any typical pediatric or adult vaccine trial. So that wasn't truncated. I mean, that's the thing that couldn't be truncated. You had to do the phase 3 efficacy safety trial, and you had to have a 2-month follow-up after the last dose, which is what we do for every vaccine. So that wasn't truncated. What happened was that the vaccine was mass produced at the same time you did the phase 3 trials. No company would ever do that. They would wait to see the results of the phase 3 trial, and if it worked and it was safe, then they would build the building, then they would mass produce it, and then they would sell it. But here, the government basically took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies and said, look, we'll pay for the mass production, even if it means we have to throw away tens of millions of doses. We'll do that because we're hopeful that this will work and we need to get this vaccine out as quickly as possible. I think the only real difference is when we met, I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, when we met in December 10th and December 17th to approve these vaccines, we could comfortably say they were safe in tens of thousands of people. We were comfortably say they were effective. But the difference is we could only say they were effective for a few months. We didn't know that they were going to be effective for years. We didn't know that. On the other hand, you're not going to do a 1 or 2 or 3 year study in the midst of a pandemic. You're going to say, look, if it's 95% effective in 3 months, it's probably going to be highly effective for a while, which certainly has been true. So I think that no, I understand the concern, because the fastest vaccine ever made before this was the mumps vaccine, and that was in the 60s when regulatory requirements were far less than they are now. I worked on the rotavirus vaccine. That was a 26-year effort. That's not unusually long. So I can certainly understand where people would think this, but I think it's, other than sort of not knowing how long it would be effective, that really was the only major real difference.
So I think my natural question would be, why did it take you 26 years then?
Well, it was a number of reasons. I think not the least of which was that one of the rotavirus vaccine called RotaShield was found to be a rare cause of intussusception, which was intestinal blockage. So we had to do a much bigger trial for efficacy because you wanted to make sure the vaccine was safe. So we ended up doing a 70,000 person prospective placebo-controlled 4-year 11-country, $350 million trial. I mean, that's what had to happen there. And it's for babies. So you start with adults, then you work your way down to babies. Here we started with adults, and because it was going to be a vaccine for adults.
So do you not think some of the long-term testing that you did on your vaccine do you not think we could benefit from that? If we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, if we didn't have such an urgency to get people vaccinated, do you not think it would have been beneficial to like have waited a couple of years to see the long-term impact?
I mean, in the 200 years of vaccine development, from the smallpox vaccine in the late 1700s to now, all of the serious adverse events, and I mean serious adverse events, where people are permanently harmed or killed by a vaccine, all of those negative things, those serious side effects, have occurred within 2 months of a dose. So, I mean, anaphylaxis, meaning a severe allergic reaction, narcolepsy is a consequence of the squalene adjuvanted flu vaccine that was used in Europe, or the problems associated with the smallpox vaccine of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the muscle, or pericarditis, or lowered platelet count caused by measles vaccine, or intussusception caused by the rotavirus vaccine, or polio caused by the oral polio vaccine. All those things occur soon after a dose. So I think when people say, now you may not figure it out until after it's in millions of people because it's that rare, which is what we're finding, right? Myocarditis in roughly 1 in 50,000 people was not going to be picked up pre-approval any more than Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is 1 in 120,000 people, or clotting, severe clotting, meaning clotting in the brain, which is more like 1 in 500,000 people. You're not going to pick that up early, but it still occurs typically within really a couple weeks of a dose. So. But that's always true. You never, Maurice Hilleman, who I think is the father of modern vaccines, said it best. He said, I never breathe a sigh of relief until the first 3 million doses are out there. I think that's always true.
And I think so. I think the point you've made really clarifies things out for anyone who's like hesitant in any shape or form. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you're essentially saying that there hasn't been, as far as we know, there hasn't been any long-term vaccine side effects in the history of vaccines.
That's right. So when people say, yeah, but we don't know 10 years from now, 20 years from now what's going to happen, give me an example of any time that's been an issue in vaccines. I mean, it's you're inoculated with this vaccine, whether it's a live attenuated virus, or whether it's a whole killed virus, or whether it's a purified protein, or in this case, whether it's a genetic vaccine. You make an immune response, and then your immune response settles down. I mean, why? And the proteins or the viruses or whatever are gone usually within a few days or a week or so. So why would you think something would happen 10 years later?
That's I hope we've managed to convince a lot of people by that, because a lot of notions, people, oh yeah, I'll do it in like 10 years when I see everyone. But yeah, you're making the point that it will be out of your system soon. So I think that's really important for people to know. And people, I think media sensationalizes, especially media headlines. They sensationalize a lot of the 1 in a million potential side effects, right? And I think that's causing a lot of we talk about social media conspiracy theories. I think there's a valid point there, but I think the media itself, the way they are designed to crave for attention, create panic. I think that the whole system, so they've picked up any singular studies that show some potential rare side effects in like 1 in a million, and they've turned it into a headline. I think that might be causing a lot of contributing to a lot of vaccine hesitancy.
No, I think the other thing, just to amplify that, when you see myocarditis, say inflammation of the heart muscle associated with mRNA vaccine occurring at 1 in 50,000, remember that myocarditis is also a consequence of the natural infection. And one study that came out of Ohio State University showed that it would occur in roughly 1 in 45 people. Not 1 in 50,000, 1 in 45 people who were infected with SARS-CoV-2. Guillain-Barré syndrome is also, which is a neurological disorder, is also a consequence of natural infection. As is thrombosis, including severe thrombosis, meaning blood clots, is a consequence of natural infection. Actually, about 16% of people who are infected with SARS-CoV-2 have some evidence for thrombosis, blood clotting. So, it's pay me now, pay me later. A choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's just a choice to take a different risk. In this case, since you're risking natural infection, it's a more serious risk.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When I just was thinking of whether to get the vaccine or not, I was like, okay, there may be risks in taking the vaccine, but the risks are still far lower than the virus itself. That was an easy choice for me.
No, there's a risk in everything. I would argue the biggest risk in vaccines typically is driving to the office to get them.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah. So one of my friends was telling me, oh yeah, there are risks in vaccines as he was smoking. That's the funniest thing I've heard. I was like, there is more risk in your cigarette than there is in the vaccine. You know that. Thought I would share it with you. Um, so I know you've written a new book that's coming out this month, right? Could you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about your new book?
Right. It's called You Bet Your Life. Here's a galley proof. See right here. You Bet Your Life.
Brilliant.
And the subtitle is from blood transfusions to mass vaccination, the long and risky history of medical innovation. And it really just it's about just what we just talked about. It's about the fact that that when we that every medical advance, whatever medical advance, I go through 9 medical advances, all the big ones, antibiotics, X-rays, chemotherapy, biologics. Everyone has been associated with tragedy. Everyone. There is always a human cost for knowledge. And the question is, when in the development of that innovation do you say, okay, now I want to do it? And so that's the way I constructed the book. Okay, so we go through X-rays or antibiotics or chemotherapy or whatever. Okay, would you get it now? Would you get it now? Would you get a blood transfusion now? But you still don't know about this that you then find out. And then you still don't know about this that you then find out. So you didn't know about RH factor. You didn't know about HIV. I mean, there's always some level of risk. And I think people don't quite see it that way, even though, if you take a bath or a shower, there are people that die in bath and shower accidents. You walk inside on a rainy day, you could be struck by lightning. You have a 1 in 770,000 chance of being struck by lightning. And I think that's what I'm trying to get to in this book, is people to understand the nature of risk, of relative risk. And it's fun in doing it, because I sort of make it a story, okay, like here's X-rays. Would you get an X-ray now? Would you get an X-ray now? And the radiologists were losing fingers and had cancer because we just couldn't control that apparatus.
So how do you think we walk that fine line of whether, when deciding to go along with a certain medical procedure, a certain drug, a certain vaccine? So how do we, what criteria could you make us a checklist of what things, like under what circumstances you would do it, under what circumstances you'd be like, let's hold on a bit, let's not rush this too much?
Right, well, so take heart transplants. I think initially when we were doing heart transplants, the people who got heart transplants were on the verge of death. It was an easy decision to make. If they didn't get a heart transplant, they were going to die soon. But we got better and better at sort of understanding how to make it so that a heart transplant recipient could live a few years, then 5 years, then 10 years, then 15 years, 20 years. So you got better and better as we were able to learn certain things about key elements of heart transplantation. And so now you have probably about 4,000 people on the waiting list for a heart transplant who need a heart transplant. They need it. Probably 1,300 of them will die while waiting. So what do? I mean, should they do something like get transplanted with a pig heart? You now can potentially do that. We don't know a lot about pig heart transplants. We'll find out, no doubt, over time. Or CRISPR technology, gene editing technology. People who have sickle cell disease can largely benefit from that. Take out their bone marrow, re-engineer their bone marrow cells with this CRISPR technology, put it back in there, and then see what happens. And that's just starting to happen. I have no doubt we are going to learn about some things we wish we knew now that we are only going to learn in the future. So there's always at some level a risk. So I think what you can do as a consumer is learn as much as you can about this technology and what's known about this technology, and realize that if you're going to leap, you should have as much information as possible. The old analogy is that if you're about to cross a rickety bridge, and I don't want to do that. I want to go walk 3 miles and get to the safer bridge. But if the lion's chasing you, you'll go over the rickety bridge because you don't have that chance to go over the 3 miles. So that's the question: is to what extent a lion is chasing you as you're approaching this rickety bridge.
Yeah, that's fair. And do you think these sort of dilemmas will increase as we go into the future, about whether do we do it or do we not do it, as with new technologies, new innovations. Uh, can you see a future where that's a big issue?
Yes, I think as we get, I mean, CRISPR technology is one example, but we now can do some very powerful things. But there is no doubt we're going to learn as we go. If you look at the first sort of the first gene therapy that at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a boy named Jesse Gelsinger who died associated with a gene therapy that actually was very similar to the adenovirus vectors that we're now using for vaccines. I mean, he was given massively more of that vector than we're getting now, but he was overwhelmed and died. And then we learned from that, and so people said, okay, well, I'm going to use a different vector. I'm not going to use this adenovirus vector. I'm going to use a retrovirus vector, which much more easily inserts itself into your own DNA. And then, French researchers found that if that could potentially insert itself right in front of a gene that, if activated, could cause leukemia. And 3 of the first 10 people that got that retrovirus gene therapy died of leukemia, including children. And they say, okay, now I realize that can happen. I'm going to alter this retrovirus, put in a sequence so that can't happen. And then the retrovirus worked well. But, should those children who needed some sort of genetic therapy because they had severe combined immunodeficiencies, they didn't have an immune system, this would have helped them have a more functional immune system. Choices are always made under uncertainty. That's always true. And the issue is how much uncertainty. And you only really know that in retrospect. You just have to leap at some level. And then we did with this vaccine. I mean, with the mRNA vaccine, we had tested in tens of thousands of people, but we hadn't tested in hundreds of millions of people. And it was only when it was in hundreds of millions of people that you had found some surprises. I think no one would have predicted myocarditis. I think no one would have predicted these severe clotting, including clotting in the brain. The Guillain-Barré syndrome was a little more predictable because it's happened with other vaccines, but we haven't seen that yet in vaccines, these kinds of problems. So it was surprising, and you learn as you go. And people are always angry at that. They always think you should know. I think if you ask people, do you think we'll know more about science and medicine 100 years from now than we know now? I think everybody would say yes, but they still think you should know everything you need to know right now, when you often don't.
Really interesting. And so my final question to you would be, since I know you've been involved, with a lot of, you've written books about vaccine denialism, and yet we see there is a lot of it. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, denialism, and that seems to be the reason we still have COVID around in, like, at least the developed part of the world. So are you an optimist or a pessimist about the future?
I'm generally an optimist. I mean, I think that when the dust settles on this pandemic, that we will see what vaccines could do. I do believe that. I know that there's an enormous amount of willful ignorance in this country, an enormous amount of sort of spectacular selfishness, but I'd like to think when the dust settles, we'll see how this played out. I mean, assuming we're in any sense educable, which we may not be.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Take care. Nice meeting you. Good luck.
Bye-bye.